There are a few miscellaneous things I should go back to before going on to conclude this talk. And, I think one thing I need to emphasize is I think my research with native healers has helped prepare the way for greater cooperation between native and conventional healers. I mentioned that doctors at the U of A were quite impressed after seeing slides of before and after experiments with psoriasis patients. Russell Willier, I think, is very good about this. When a patient would come and ask to be healed, if he was familiar with this problem and had treated it before, he would say, yes, I can help you. Or if he wasn't familiar with it, he would say, well, give me 3 days. I have to go to the forest and meditate, and fast, and then I can tell you whether I can help or not. And he would do that, and while he was in the forest, he would have a vision where a plant spirit or an animal spirit would come in the form of a human and tell him which plant, how to make give him the recipe for putting together a new combination which he wasn't familiar with, and moreover, where to find the plants. So armed with that knowledge, then he could come back and tell the person, yeah, I think I can help you. Or in some cases, he would say, no, I can't help you. You need to go see a doctor right away, maybe even go to emergency right away. So he was very open to, or in some cases he would say, I can't help you, but I know another healer who's dealt with this issue before, so he would refer. So I think, and in return, I think there's been an increasing acceptance of native medicine on the part of Western doctors, and realizing that it can be helpful to people. So I hope that our research has helped with collaboration. I mentioned the Cree healer cardinal at the working at the hospital at the University of Alberta, teaching medical students. Just the fact that medical students are being exposed to these methods, and in some cases being given the opportunity to participate in rituals such as sweat lodge and so forth, I think this is going to have a big impact as they go out and become doctors and researchers. I think another thing I'd like to say a little bit more is the research with John Gee that produced this book. In this book, 10 anthropologists talked about experiences which we call it the anthropology of extraordinary experiences. We don't think they're supernatural experiences. I think Jean Guy and I both agree that there's only one world. That's the natural world. I don't believe in the supernatural. I shouldn't say that too loud around Native people, I guess, but I don't believe in the supernatural. I don't know exactly how Jean Guy feels about that, but I think these experiences that people talk about, which are unusual, really are part of what it means to be a human. They're part of human psychology, and we've learned to accommodate these things in the evolution of our species. And as anthropologists, if we really want to understand the human species, we need to be open to exploring, because I think the brain is capable of many things which we don't understand. There's a lot of research on the brain now. I mean, you see articles all over the place. They're learning that what the things the brain can do that we didn't realize before. And I think a lot of those things we call supernatural or extraordinary are part of the natural functioning of the brain. that's some of the things I try and explore in the Mouse Woman book as well. In terms of the reaction to this book, we haven't had a lot of reaction. We haven't had, I haven't received any negative criticism, but I haven't heard too much about it. I understand that it is being used in classes, which is good. And University of Toronto sends us a statement once in a while saying they're still selling a few of these books, so I guess it's still being read. But this is a very interesting book for me to work on with Jean-Guy. Is there anything else there that you wanted me to cover?
Well, it's cross-cultural, but could it be cross-natural, or what could we expect of meetings between human beings, for instance, and animals, or?
Oh, I see. Well, yeah. Well, that's interesting. I don't know exactly what to say about that, but I think, we were talking at lunch about the fact that a lot of, or at least some medicines based on natural plants we found out about by looking at monkeys. You mentioned that. Looking at monkeys and observing how they use plants. I know we had a person in our department at U of A, Linda Fedigan, who went to the University of Calgary, who's done a lot of work with monkeys, and monkeys who have been relocated to a big compound with thousands of acres, I guess, in Texas. And when the new monkeys are born, they have to be taught by the parents how to avoid the poisonous plants. So animals do have cultural traditions which are passed on. They have medical traditions. And so I think we can learn from animals. The example of elephants that'll travel hundreds of miles to find a particular plant that'll help them with the medical problem that they have. And so it used to be said, when I started graduate school, that only humans had culture. Well, we now know that's not true. Animals have cultures too. They may not be nearly as complicated as ours, but knowledge is passed on from one generation to another. In fact, their lineages. The other thing that Linda Fedigan found was that there are very clear lineages, say from mothers, high status mothers, and her daughter will pick up that status. And the same thing goes with monkeys with specialized knowledge in a group. They're recognized for their knowledge, which is passed on. So yeah, that human-animal interaction is very important. The other thing to re-emphasize is just the necessity of cross-cultural research. One of the things that postmodernists didn't believe in cross-cultural research, or at least comparative research. They thought each culture had to be described in its own terms. And you do cultures a disservice if you put them in a framework which allows you to compare. Well, I think that's wrong. I think it is important to compare cultures and to try to come to generalizations, because after all, anthropology is the study of the human species. We can't just talk about local cultures. That is not what we're about, and that's important too, to document local cultures. But it's also important to try and understand our species as a whole, how we evolved, how we moved out of Africa into Europe and Asia and eventually to the New World, using and adapting to a variety of environments, using culture as our primary adaptive tool. That's what anthropology is about. We can't do that unless we do cross-cultural comparisons. And I think we can do those kind of comparisons in the area of religion and ritual as well. But it does mean getting inside to take what some people call an emic perspective. So I think anthropology has to combine emic and etic perspectives. To get inside, we have to get inside to get the emic perspective, what it looks like from the inside. We have to do the etic thing, looking at it from the outside, looking for ways to compare. unless we do both, we're not really doing the job that we should. Talk a little bit about ongoing research. I'm slowing down now as in my writing because it takes a long time. It takes a couple of years to do a book. I know the architecture and gardens book took 2 years each. That's 7 days a week, and very intensive. We didn't have time for anything else. It cost us $25,000 up front to do the research. Expensive. We've more than recovered that through royalties, but at the time that was a lot of money out of our pocket. But I am slowing down, but there is some ongoing research. The mouse woman that I've mentioned is on the property of a man called Don Gatley and his wife. Don hopes to start a healing center in connection with the mouse woman that will focus on the preservation of traditional healing knowledge. And what we want to do at this center when people come to be healed, in addition to workshops and so forth, when they come to be healed, is to encourage them to come with medical records documenting their condition before treatment, and then to follow up with medical records, go back to a doctor and get good medical records about progress they've made, if any. The problem with the examples of healing that I gave about the mouse woman and most other projects of this kind is they're considered by medical researchers, they're called anecdotal evidence, which means they're interesting stories, but they're not not perceived as being having much scientific value. So what we really need is a solid body of research with before and after medical records. So a center of this sort should have a doctor on hand at the center who can observe the treatment and document that, follow up with documentation afterwards. And so eventually I think if we can do this and come up with enough solid research, we can do a sequel to the Mouse Woman book. So that's mainly what I'm involved in right now. I think the last thing I would like to talk about is how I see the future of anthropology. At least from my perspective, what holds the different fields of anthropology together, or at least my different kinds of research together, is the emphasis upon experiential anthropology, of getting involved with the people you're studying, earning their trust, getting invited to their sacred ceremonies, this sort of thing. I think anthropology has 4 primary goals or challenges, which is a little repetitious because I've already talked about this, but I think the first challenge is to learn how to set aside the normal scientific approach when it is not appropriate. Sometimes it is appropriate, but sometimes it's not. We have to learn how to suspend disbelief in the face of strange rituals and practices, and we have to learn how to participate as fully as possible. Without giving up our own beliefs, we can't do that. We can't get rid of our cultural baggage. We can't really go native even if we want to, but we can do the best we can. And this is what I've called the emic portion of the anthropological endeavor. The second challenge, I think, is to learn to be more effective in the hermeneutic enterprise of explaining a culture one has experienced and studied to people in one's own culture in a way that also makes sense to one's informants. So just to break that down a little bit, anthropologists have always been gatekeepers and cultural interpreters, but sometimes the models that we use to explain what we've studied in another culture don't make much sense to the people that we've studied. And I think if that's the case, we're probably on the wrong track. is if you can't take your model back, your explanation back, and the people can understand it and say, yeah, that, usually the reaction we get is, well, I wouldn't say it that way. That sounds kind of odd, but I think it's okay. I don't see anything wrong there with what you said. If you can get that kind of a reaction, then I think you can feel that you're on the right track. But I think we need to do more of that. We need to, what Jean-Guy Goulet and I have called taking our informants seriously regarding their worldview and their practices as not something to be skeptical about or to scorn or to laugh at or view as pagan rituals or any of the rest of it, but that they've discovered something important, and we need to try our best to appreciate what that is. The third thing, which I've already mentioned as well, is we have to engage in comparative cultures, in comparing different cultures in terms of how they perceive and explain the world. Now, it's obvious that one anthropologist can't study too many different cultures in depth. For me, it's been mostly Japan, a little bit of China, some other places, but not really in depth. Japan's been the only place I've studied in depth. So to do this cross-cultural thing successfully, we have to put together interdisciplinary teams. We can't continue doing research as individuals. We have to put together teams that of individuals who have different kinds of expertise, who have different kinds of in-depth experience in different cultures, and then we can start working on meta models. Fourth, I think that anthropological theories come and go. I know when I've tried to go through my library to get rid of books that I don't need anymore, I find most of the books on theory I can get rid of. Because they're dated, they're not that useful. A good solid ethnography is useful. And so I keep those. But I think that the best anthropological theory arises when anthropologists address real problems and attempt to find solutions that improve the lives of people everywhere. This is called applied anthropology. I think applied anthropology has been looked down a little bit by anthropologists as being inferior, as not being as valuable as pure theory or something like that. But I don't think that's the case. I think, in my experience, the best theory comes out of real situations. And as I mentioned before, the best theory has to involve the theories of the people you're studying as well. It can't be just your theory. So you have to, a meta model, sounds like a mysterious term, but a meta model is it's a model that is abstract enough that it includes the model of your informants and your own model. And in medical research, they do this all the time. They'll go through hundreds of studies and examine the results and then try and put those results in terms of a general model that comes up with generalizations that pulls the strongest points out of the things they've studied. Well, I think we have to learn to do more of that in anthropology. So in brief, in my opinion, the challenge to modern anthropology is to develop new and better methods and theories in the areas of experiential anthropology, in hermeneutics, in comparative research, and in applied anthropology. Now, of course, there are lots of other areas that are important as well, but these are ones that are of particular interest to me. I'd like to talk just a little bit about the concept of nature in Japan, because that is important for understanding Japanese aesthetics. After I do that, I'd like to talk a little bit about why I feel anthropological aesthetics is at the core of anthropology. Some people tend to think it's on the periphery somewhere. I think it's essential for human survival. But let's do the nature thing first. The Japanese concept of, or the relation to nature is quite different than here in Canada. Japanese are a little bit scared of wild nature. When they go hiking in the mountains, they go in a group. I remember when we were living in Japan, we were tired of we were tired of the city, and we really wanted to go camping. So we went to a campground that we had seen advertised, and we asked if we could rent. They had tents that were set up. We asked if we could rent one of their tents, and they said, well, how many people would be coming? And we said 2. And they laughed. They said 2? They said it has to be a minimum of 50. So once we went camping in Hokkaido, and we were off by ourselves and had set up our tent and so forth, and after a while we saw in the distance a big bonfire, and we heard singing, and so we went over to see what was going on, and there were Japanese campers, and there were about 500 of them around this fire. So you don't go into the wilderness by yourself. That's dangerous. The wilderness is wild. So in a Japanese garden, it's interesting. You try and recreate a natural feeling, but of course it's engineered. It's not really nature. You know, you're trimming the trees and you're placing the rocks in a certain way. And the famous Japanese gardens, such as at Ryoanji, the famous stone garden from Kyoto, are supposed to look the same century after century. Well, this takes a lot of work. And so it's not really what we would call nature, but you're supposed to get that feeling of nature when you sit and meditate and look at a Japanese garden. There's one garden that got out of hand in Kyoto. It's a famous one as well, but they planted all these trees. Now they didn't have money to keep them pruned and keep them small, and so they grew up into this beautiful forest. And it is actually more what we would call natural, but it has walls around it, and so it's not really like being out in the mountains. So it's not considered dangerous. But that whole concept of nature as being viewing humans as coming out of nature and communing with nature, they don't have that same concept. Once in a class, I mentioned to my students at Kansai Gaidai University that I thought the Japanese didn't have a true appreciation of nature. And one of my students got very upset. She said, well, what are you talking about? That's what Japanese gardens are all about. And I said, no, Japanese gardens aren't about nature. Japanese gardens are a work of art. By definition, art is an artifact. That's where the word art comes from. Gardens are an artifact. And in the case of the Japanese gardens, they're created to look natural. For example, there's a well-known book on Japanese gardens that after you've laid everything out and the way you want it, then you take a pile of stones and you just dump it somewhere. Anywhere. Give a more natural feeling. The famous tea master, who was tea master to Hideyoshi, the great warlord in medieval Japan, before a tea ceremony, you have a little tea house and you have the Japanese garden and so on, where people come and they step on the rocks, and it's kind of contrived. The small rocks, you keep moving. When you get to a big rock, you stop and you contemplate, look around, and so forth. So before a tea ceremony, he had his helper, go out and rake up all the leaves, all the maple leaves, which he did. And then Sen no Rikyu, the master, went out and he looked at it and says, oh, you did a very nice job. He says, now go shake that maple tree. And scatter some, have some leaves come down. So that's kind of gets at the essence of the Japanese feeling of nature. It's kind of contrived, but that's okay, because it's, from our point of view, it's art. We don't expect art to be nature facts. Art is created by human beings. The second topic I mentioned, which I feel very strongly about, is that the reason I feel anthropological aesthetics is so important is because, see, aesthetics has to do with how we perceive and interpret aesthetic attributes in the world around us: color, line, movement, form, texture, and so forth. Now, these are the things we need to perceive and interpret correctly if we're going to survive. Because if we interpret those things wrong, we're in trouble. And so we do aesthetic activity all the time. Every day, everything that we do, we are perceiving the aesthetic attributes of the world around us, and we're using that information to decide what to do and how do we respond appropriately, whether it's a dangerous environment, whether it's a safe environment, and so forth. And so it's not just creating artifacts, it's responding to the natural world. Of course, Japanese do that like we all do, but they may not see that as part of aesthetics. But that to me, that's what anthropological aesthetics is about. That's at the individual level. At the societal level, I think anthropological aesthetics is very important because in things like gardens or architecture or other art forms, we see encapsulated the core values of a society, the things that they feel are really important. Sometimes I used to teach a course on anthropology of art or anthropological aesthetics at the University of Alberta. Coming up with a definition of what art is very difficult. And so I eventually concluded, I would tell my class that an art object or a performance is something that is sufficiently beautiful or interesting that it causes you to want to stop and contemplate it. So it doesn't have to be beautiful. It can be beautiful, but if it's not beautiful, at least it has to be interesting enough that you feel compelled to stop and contemplate it. And when we stop and contemplate something like a Japanese garden, we are getting the core values like some of the ones I mentioned earlier: austerity, the subdued quietness, tranquility. All of those things are embodied in a Japanese garden. And so that's why a Zen meditation garden, you go sit on the porch of a temple and you look at the garden and you come face to face with the eternal, not just the values of that society, but with those eternal things. Or it can be a walking garden where the view is constantly changing and new views are coming into sight. The activity is different, but again, you find those same things are important, of restoring tranquility to the soul. And so it's very important to see art as a kind of a shortcut to getting to the core values of a society. So both at the individual level and at the societal level, I've always felt that art should be at the center of the anthropological endeavor, but it doesn't tend to be. It tends to be, not very many anthropologists have done books on an anthropological approach to art. I only know of one other person who's done it. Whereas you got a lot of people doing economics or politics or whatever, but hardly anybody really doing seriously the anthropology of art. But hopefully that'll change. I don't know if it will or not, but I'd like to say a few words about the relationship between Aboriginal religion and Zen. I mentioned that I became interested in Zen when I was at Yale University, and that's what led me to Japan and eventually to specialize in Japanese studies. Um, I think the thing that attracted me to Zen in the first place was that it is a scientific religion. Scientific in the sense that one of the basic teachings of Zen Buddhism is that you do not have to accept anything that you haven't experienced yourself. So that ties in with my later emphasis upon experiential anthropology. I was always kind of a skeptical kind. I found that when I went home to visit my parents and went to church with them, and they stood up to say the Apostles' Creed, that I didn't believe a single item. And it seemed to me that science and religion were really separated if you take that kind of orthodox position. And whereas Zen Buddhism in general believes that everything is constantly changing, and that I think an important thing is that in Buddhism there are two aspects to the eternal. One is you have the pure potential, which is constantly expressing itself in the phenomenal world. And so that the world we see around us of the universe is not an artifact. It's not the creation of God. It is God. It is the material manifestation of the eternal. So it comes into being, it dissolves, and it goes back to pure potential. And so this ongoing movement of creation, dissolution, and return, it's this process that what we mean by God in Zen. God is not a personal deity, but it's this eternal process. But since I think the important thing, if we want to compare it to Aboriginal religion, is that since the material world around us, the world of nature, is not an artifact, but the visible expression of God, that everything is sacred, and everything has to be treated that way. So one of the things that impressed me in working with Russell Willier, he emphasized that we are no better, human beings are no better than a blade of grass. And that a rock is one of the most important grandfathers and grandmothers. It's eternal, it's durable, and so forth. The rock is not dead, it's alive. And of course that accords with the subatomic particle physics too, doesn't it? Because whether it's me or a rock, we're all composed of these subatomic particles that come into existence and are gone again, constant change. And so in both Aboriginal religion and in Zen, we as human beings are connected to everything in the universe. Not just that we have a relationship with them, but we are connected. We're all the same thing. We're all what Zen Buddhists call the Buddha nature. So it's not that the Buddha nature resides in everything. Everything resides in the Buddha nature. You just have to reverse that. And I think in talking to Russell Willier about my beliefs as a Zen Buddhist, he constantly said, well, that's exactly what we believe. So I think the only difference between the two, as far as I can see, is that in Zen, as you go deeper into meditation, you will experience some of the things that Native people experience in terms of seeing spirits and so forth. But in Zen, they teach you ignore it, because those are psychological phenomena. And what you're trying to do is get through to a direct encounter of ultimate reality itself. So you don't want to get sidetracked. Whereas for Aboriginal people, of course, those experiences of spirits are very important. The ultimate reality is too sacred. You can't experience it directly. You have to go through intermediary. That's what a shaman is all about. A shaman is an intermediary. The person goes to the shaman goes to the grandfathers and grandmothers, grandmothers and grandfathers go to the Holy Spirit, or go to the Creator, and get power, healing, wisdom, knowledge, bring it back as messages to the shaman, and then the shaman does these rituals and healing and so forth. So you've got that sort of sequence, whereas in Zen, we try to cut through all of that to have a direct experience of ultimate reality itself. So there is that difference. But other than that, they're very compatible. They both have a great respect for nature. And I think which Christianity, unfortunately, in seeing, in emphasizing in Genesis that God created the world, then the world becomes an artifact. And like any other artifact, it can be destroyed or not, but it doesn't, it may give us information about the Creator, but it doesn't, when we damage nature, we're not damaging the Creator directly. And so I find that in talking with Native people, Native healers, taking part in Native rituals, I feel quite at home. And also I feel I don't see any conflict between science and religion. So which I think is a good thing. I think this conflict between science and religion is a false dichotomy, which never should have appeared in the first place.